The morning that should have been the happiest of Clara Bennett's life became the one she wished she could forget. The little white church at the edge of the frontier town was decorated with wildflowers gathered by neighbors. Candles flickered near the windows, and the pews were filled with smiling faces waiting to celebrate a wedding. Clara stood in a modest cream-colored dress her late mother had sewn years earlier, smoothing the wrinkles in her skirt with trembling hands. She was nervous, but hopeful. She believed that once she walked through those church doors, a new chapter of happiness would begin. Instead, everything fell apart. Whispers spread through the church before the ceremony even started. Her fiancé, Richard Hale, had not arrived. Minutes passed. Then nearly an hour. Finally, Richard entered the church alone, his polished boots echoing across the wooden floor. He didn't look at Clara until he stood only a few feet away. "I'm sorry," he said coldly. "I can't do this." The church fell silent. Clara stared at him, unable to understand. "Richard, what do you mean?" He sighed as though he were discussing a business deal instead of breaking a heart. "I need a wife who already knows how to manage a proper home. Someone who can cook, bake, entertain guests, and help build my reputation. Everyone knows you've spent your life caring for your sick father instead of learning what a wife should know." The word struck Clara harder than any slap. "I've done my best," she whispered. Richard shrugged without sympathy. "Your best isn't enough." Without another word, he turned and walked out of the church, leaving behind stunned guests and a bride frozen in disbelief. The whispers returned, louder than before. "What a shame. Poor girl. I suppose he wanted someone more capable." Though a few kind neighbors tried to comfort her, Clara barely heard them. She gathered her skirt and hurried from the church before anyone could see the tears running down her face. For days she remained inside the small cottage she had shared with her father before his passing. The cupboards held little food, and the savings they had once depended on were nearly gone. Every knock at the door filled her with dread, fearing another curious neighbor or another person offering pity she could no longer bear. She blamed herself. Perhaps Richard had been right. She could read, keep careful records, and mend torn clothes, but she had never mastered cooking. Years spent nursing her father through illness had left little time to learn the skills many women her age had practiced since childhood. Late one afternoon, another knock sounded at her door. Expecting another sympathetic visitor, Clara slowly opened it. Standing outside was an older gentleman dressed in worn ranch clothes. His weathered face carried kindness rather than judgment. "My name is Samuel Walker," he introduced himself. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Clara invited him inside. Samuel explained that he had come on behalf of his son, Ethan Walker, a widowed rancher who lived several miles beyond town. Ethan had lost his wife 2 years earlier to illness and had been raising his young daughter alone while struggling to keep the ranch running. "He isn't looking for perfection," Samuel said quietly. "He's looking for a partner who's honest and willing to build a life together." Clara looked down at her folded hands. "You've heard what happened," she said softly. Samuel nodded. "I've heard gossip," he answered. "I prefer meeting people before believing stories." His gentle reply surprised her. "There won't be riches," Samuel continued. "The ranch needs hard work. My granddaughter needs kindness. Ethan doesn't promise romance, but he promises respect." Respect. No one had offered her that in weeks. After a long silence, Clara agreed to meet Ethan. The following afternoon, Samuel drove her to the Walker Ranch. Rolling fields stretched toward distant hills, while a sturdy farmhouse stood beside a weathered red barn. Chickens wandered freely across the yard, and smoke drifted lazily from the chimney. Ethan Walker was waiting near the porch. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed plainly, with sun-worn hands that spoke of years of honest labor. Beside him stood his shy 7-year-old daughter, Lily, clutching a small rag doll. Ethan greeted Clara with a polite nod. Thank you for coming." They sat together on the porch while Samuel entertained Lily nearby. Neither spoke for several moments. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "I won't pretend this is an ordinary courtship." Clara managed a faint smile. "I don't suppose either of us has had an ordinary year." That earned the smallest smile from Ethan. After another pause, he asked the question she had begun to fear more than any other. "Can you cook?" Clara lowered her eyes, expecting disappointment all over again. She could have lied. She could have claimed she knew enough to manage. Instead, she chose honesty. "No," she admitted quietly. "I can't. But I can learn if you'll be patient with me." The wind rustled through the cottonwood trees as silence settled between them. Then, to Clara's surprise, Ethan smiled, not with amusement or mockery, but with warmth. "That's a good answer," he said. "Because the truth is, I'm not much of a cook either." Clara looked up in disbelief. Ethan chuckled softly. "My daughter and I have burned more biscuits than I'd care to admit." For the first time since the wedding that never happened, Clara laughed. It was a small laugh, fragile and uncertain, but real. And in that simple moment, she realized she had found something far more valuable than perfection. She had found kindness. Clara became Mrs. Ethan Walker on a quiet autumn morning. There was no crowded church, no expensive decorations, and no curious townspeople whispering behind their hands. Only Samuel Walker, little Lily, and the traveling pastor stood beneath the wide branches of an old oak tree overlooking the ranch. The ceremony lasted only a few minutes, but every promise spoken was sincere. As they walked back toward the farmhouse, Lily slipped her small hand into Clara's. "Will you stay here now?" she asked shyly. Clara smiled warmly. "If your father doesn't mind." Lily looked up at Ethan. He nodded. "I was hoping she would." The little girl beamed, and for the first time Clara felt that perhaps she truly belonged somewhere. The first evening in the farmhouse was quieter than she expected. Ethan showed her the simple kitchen, stocked with flour, beans, potatoes, dried herbs, and a few jars of preserved vegetables. "I should warn you," he said with a grin. "The kitchen has defeated both Lily and me many times." Clara laughed nervously. "I'll try not to make it worse." "You'd have to work pretty hard." His easy humor eased her worries. The next morning Clara woke before sunrise, determined to prepare breakfast before Ethan left for the fields. She tied on an apron, gathered flour and eggs, and tried to remember the few cooking lessons she had watched years before. The result was unforgettable. Smoke poured from the stove. The biscuits became as hard as stones. The eggs stuck firmly to the iron pan. By the time Ethan and Lily entered the kitchen, Clara was standing by the open window, desperately waving a towel to clear the smoke. "I'm so sorry," she said, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. "I ruined everything." Ethan picked up one of the biscuits and tapped it against the wooden table. It made a loud knocking sound. Lily burst into laughter. Even Ethan couldn't hide his smile. "I think this one could repair the fence," he joked. For one terrible second Clara thought they were laughing at her. Instead, Ethan broke the biscuit in half with both hands and took a bite anyway. "It's not perfect," he admitted after chewing carefully. "But I've eaten worse." "You have?" Clara asked. "Oh yes." He opened a cupboard and pulled out a blackened frying pan. "This was my first attempt at supper after my wife passed away. The bottom of the pan was permanently scorched. I burned stew so badly that the chickens refused to eat it." Lily nodded seriously. "They really did." Clara couldn't help laughing. The knot of fear that had lived inside her for weeks loosened a little more. After breakfast, Ethan suggested they learn together instead of pretending either of them knew everything. Each evening they chose one simple recipe. One night they baked bread. Another night they made vegetable soup. Sometimes the bread refused to rise. Sometimes the soup had far too much salt. Once they accidentally added sugar instead of flour to a batch of biscuits. Lily declared they tasted interesting. By the end of the week, they had learned one important lesson. Mistakes were easier to bear when everyone laughed together. Samuel visited often and occasionally offered advice. "You need bread with your hands," he reminded Ethan one afternoon. "I thought I was." Samuel chuckled. "You were wrestling it." Little by little, Clara began understanding the rhythm of the kitchen. She learned how hot the stove should be before placing a pan on it. She discovered that fresh herbs changed the flavor of soup completely. She learned that bread dough required patience more than strength. Every small success filled her with quiet confidence. Outside the kitchen, life on the ranch settled into a comfortable routine. Clara helped Lily with reading lessons while Ethan repaired fences and cared for the horses. She swept the farmhouse, mended worn clothes, and organized shelves that had long been neglected. Though she still had much to learn, the house slowly felt brighter and more welcoming. One afternoon, Clara noticed Ethan returning from town with a thoughtful expression. "Everything all right?" she asked. He hesitated. "I heard some people talking." She immediately knew what that meant. "They were speaking about me." He nodded reluctantly. "They said I married a woman who couldn't even bake bread." Clara lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry." Ethan looked genuinely puzzled. "For what?" "For embarrassing you." He shook his head firmly. "Clara, every person who says those things has forgotten what matters." She looked at him. "I didn't marry you because you already knew everything," he continued. "I married you because you're honest. Honest people can learn. Proud people rarely do." His words settled deep inside her heart. That evening Clara baked another loaf of bread. When she pulled it from the oven, the crust was golden instead of black. The smell filled the farmhouse with warmth. Ethan sliced off a piece while it was still steaming and spread butter across the top. He took one bite and smiled. "Now this," he declared, "is real bread." Lily clapped her hands excitedly. "We finally did it." Clara looked around the little kitchen, the flour scattered across the table, the warm loaf cooling by the window, Ethan smiling across from her, and Lily giggling beside him. Only weeks earlier she had believed her life was over. Now she realized something wonderful. A family wasn't built by never making mistakes. It was built by forgiving them, learning from them, and choosing every day to grow together. For the first time since arriving at the Walker Ranch, Clara no longer felt like a guest. She was beginning to feel at home. Part 3, The Woman She Was Becoming. Winter arrived early that year, covering the Walker Ranch in a blanket of white. The fields became quiet, the mornings colder, and every task required more effort. But inside the farmhouse, something had changed. Clara Bennett was no longer the frightened woman who had arrived carrying a suitcase and a broken heart. She was becoming someone stronger. Every morning before the sun rose, Clara stepped into the kitchen and practiced what she had once believed she could never do. She measured flour carefully, watched the stove closely, and learned from every mistake. She kept a small notebook hidden in a kitchen drawer where she wrote down everything she discovered. 2 cups of flour, not 3. Less salt in the soup. Bread needs more time near the warm stove. Those simple notes became proof of her progress. Ethan noticed. At first, he tried not to say much. He knew Clara was sensitive about her past and didn't want her to feel as though she was being judged. But he couldn't ignore the transformation happening before his eyes. The woman who once apologized every time something went wrong was beginning to stand with confidence. One morning, Ethan walked into the kitchen to find Clara preparing breakfast while Lily helped beside her. The smell of fresh cinnamon rolls filled the farmhouse. Ethan stopped in surprise. Are those the same biscuits that once tried to break my teeth? Clara turned around, pretending to be offended. Those were biscuits. These are cinnamon rolls. I've improved. Lily nodded proudly. She really has. Ethan smiled. I can see that. But cooking was only one part of Clara's growth. She began noticing problems around the ranch that others had ignored for years. The pantry was poorly organized. Supplies were being wasted. The household expenses were not carefully recorded. One evening, while reviewing old receipts, Clara discovered that Ethan was spending more money than he realized on unnecessary purchases. You've been overpaying for supplies, she told him gently. Ethan looked surprised. I have. She showed him her notes. If you buy certain things in larger amounts and preserve more food during harvest season, you'll save money before winter. Ethan studied the figures carefully. He had always been a hard-working man, but he admitted that numbers and planning were not his strengths. Where did you learn this? Clara smiled slightly. My father taught me bookkeeping. I thought it was the one skill nobody cared about. Ethan looked at her seriously. I care. Those two words meant more to Clara than he knew. For years, people had focused only on what she couldn't do. Ethan was the first person who saw what she could offer. As the months passed, Clara became an important part of the ranch. She helped manage the household, cared for the animals when needed, and worked alongside Ethan during difficult days. She wasn't trying to become someone else. She was discovering who she had always been. But not everyone in town accepted the changes. Some neighbors still remembered the abandoned bride from the church. When Clara visited town for supplies, she heard whispers behind her. That's the woman Richard left. I heard she couldn't even cook when she married Ethan. Imagine being a rancher's wife without knowing how to run a home. At first, those words hurt. They reminded her of the day she had stood alone in the church, feeling worthless. But this time, Clara didn't lower her head. She simply continued walking. Because she knew the truth. She wasn't the same woman anymore. One afternoon, a severe storm damaged part of the Walker Ranch's fencing. Several nearby ranchers struggled with the same problem, and everyone expected Ethan to handle the repairs alone. But Clara had another idea. Instead of replacing every broken section immediately, she suggested organizing the neighbors to share tools, labor, and supplies. Everyone is suffering from the storm, she explained. If they help us repair ours, we help them repair theirs. Together, everyone saves time and money. Ethan listened carefully. It was exactly the kind of practical thinking the ranch needed. Within days, the damaged fences were repaired across several properties. The neighbors who once doubted Clara began seeing her differently. She wasn't just Ethan Walker's wife. She was a woman with intelligence, patience, and determination. That evening, Ethan and Clara sat together on the porch watching the sunset. You know, Ethan said quietly, when you first came here, you told me you didn't know how to cook. Clara laughed softly. I remember. I think we both misunderstood that question. She looked at him. What do you mean? Ethan leaned back in his chair. I wasn't really asking if you could cook. I was asking if you were willing to build something with me. Clara felt her heart warm. And was I? Ethan smiled. You were willing to try. That's what mattered. The wind moved gently through the fields. Clara looked at the ranch around her, the home she had helped create, the child who now called her family, and the man who had given her a chance when others had given her judgment. She finally understood something important. Her worth had never been measured by the skills she already possessed. It was measured by her courage to learn, her willingness to love, and her strength to keep going. The humiliated bride everyone had pitied was gone. In her place stood a woman who knew exactly who she was becoming. By the time Autumn returned to the Walker Ranch, Clara Bennett had become almost unrecognizable from the woman who had arrived there months earlier. The shy bride who once feared every mistake now moved through the farmhouse with confidence. She knew exactly how much flour was needed for bread, how to preserve vegetables for the winter, and how to make a simple meal feel like a feast. But more importantly, she had learned something far greater than cooking. She had learned her own worth. The annual harvest celebration was approaching, and the entire town prepared for the event. Every year, families gathered in the town square to share food, trade goods, and celebrate the hard work that carried them through another season. For Clara, the celebration carried complicated memories. It was in that same town where she had walked away from her wedding in shame. Many people still remembered the abandoned bride who couldn't meet the expectations placed upon her. When Ethan noticed her becoming quiet while preparing for the festival, he gently asked, "Are you worried about going back?" Clara looked out toward the fields. "A little." "Why?" She hesitated. "Because some people will only remember who I was." Ethan stepped closer. "Then let them see who you are now." His words gave her courage. A few days before the celebration, the town committee faced a problem. The woman who usually prepared the main meals had fallen ill, and no one knew who could handle cooking for such a large crowd. Someone suggested Clara. The suggestion was met with hesitation. Clara Bennett? The same Clara who burned her first loaf of bread? A few people laughed. But Mrs. Wilson, an older woman who had known Clara's father, spoke up. "I've seen that girl work harder than anyone. Give her a chance." After some discussion, Clara accepted the responsibility. She knew it would not only be about food. It would be a chance to prove to herself that she was no longer the woman who had been humiliated. For days, the Walker farmhouse became a place of preparation. Clara planned every detail carefully. She made lists of ingredients. She organized helpers. She prepared recipes she had practiced many times. Lily proudly followed her around, carrying baskets and asking questions. "Do you think people will like it?" Lily asked while helping arrange jars of preserves. Clara smiled. "I hope they do. But even if they don't, we'll know we tried our best." Ethan watched them from the doorway. He admired the way Clara had changed. She no longer needed approval from others. She simply wanted to share something she had created. On the morning of the celebration, the town square filled with the smell of fresh bread, roasted vegetables, pies, and warm spices. People gathered around the long tables, curious about Clara's cooking. The first person to taste her bread was Mrs. Wilson. She took a bite and smiled. "Well, I'll be." Clara waited nervously. "This is wonderful." Soon others began trying the food. The reaction spread quickly. "The soup is incredible. Who made these pastries? These preserves taste like something my grandmother used to make." Clara stood quietly as compliments surrounded her. But she wasn't proud because people finally approved of her. She was proud because she knew how far she had come. Then someone unexpected arrived. Richard Hale. The man who had abandoned her at the church door. He walked into the celebration wearing an expensive coat, looking as confident as ever. When he saw Clara standing beside Ethan, his expression changed. He looked at the respected woman greeting neighbors, laughing with children, and receiving praise from the same people who had once whispered about her. "I heard you became quite the homemaker," Richard said. Clara looked at him calmly. "I learned a few things." Richard glanced toward Ethan. "You seem to have done well." Ethan stepped forward, his voice steady. "We have." There was no anger in his words. Only certainty. Richard looked back at Clara. "I suppose I underestimated you." Clara smiled politely. "No. You underestimated what people can become when someone believes in them." Richard had no answer. For once, Clara didn't need one. Later that evening, as the sun disappeared behind the hills, Ethan found Clara standing away from the crowd. "You did something special today," he said. Clara shook her head. "Everyone helped." "That's not what I mean." He looked at the celebration around them. "Months ago, you thought your life was ruined because one person decided you weren't enough." Clara lowered her eyes. "I remember. But today, everyone saw what I've known all along." She looked at him. "What's that?" Ethan smiled. "That you were never lacking anything important." Those words stayed with her. The woman who had once walked away from a church in tears now stood in the center of the same community with her head held high. The town no longer saw Clara Bennett as the humiliated bride. They saw her as a woman of strength, kindness, and determination. And Clara finally understood that the greatest changes in life often begin with the moments that hurt the most. Because sometimes, the person who breaks your heart unknowingly opens the door to the life you were always meant to find. The winter after the harvest celebration was one of the coldest the Walker Ranch had ever seen. Snow covered the fields, strong winds swept across the open land, and every morning brought another challenge. But inside the farmhouse, warmth filled the rooms, not just from the fire burning in the fireplace, but from the family that had grown together. Clara Bennett no longer felt like a stranger in the Walker home. She had arrived as a woman who believed she had nothing to offer. Now she woke each morning knowing that her presence mattered. She was not just Ethan's wife. She was his partner. The ranch had changed as well. Under Clara's careful planning and Ethan's hard work, the struggling property slowly became successful again. They wasted less, saved more, and found better ways to manage their resources. Clara helped organize supplies, kept careful records, and planned ahead for difficult seasons. Ethan often joked that the ranch had gained a second owner. "You know," he told her one evening while looking through the accounts, "I used to think I was good at running this place." Clara smiled. "And now?" "Now I know I was just lucky enough to survive until you arrived." She laughed. But deep inside, his words meant everything. The biggest change, however, was not in the fields or the farmhouse. It was in Lily. When Clara first arrived, the little girl had been quiet and cautious. She had lost her mother young and had learned not to become too attached to people who might leave. But over time, that fear disappeared. Clara helped her with reading, taught her simple recipes, and listened to every story she wanted to share. One evening, while Clara tucked Lily into bed, the child looked up at her. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." Lily hesitated. "When I call you Mama, does that bother you?" Clara froze. For a moment, she couldn't speak. She had dreamed of being loved, but she never expected such a precious gift. She brushed Lily's hair gently away from her face. "No, sweetheart. It doesn't bother me." Lily smiled. "Good. Because I think you are my family." Tears filled Clara's eyes. "You're my family too." Outside the bedroom door, Ethan stood quietly. He had heard every word. When Clara stepped into the hallway, he saw the emotion on her face. "Are you all right?" he asked. She nodded. "More than all right." Ethan smiled. That night, they sat together by the fire after Lily had fallen asleep. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan said something Clara never expected. "I used to think I needed someone to help run the ranch." Clara looked at him. "But?" He looked toward the stairs where Lily slept. "But I realize I needed someone to help rebuild my life." The room became quiet. Clara felt her heart race. When she first married Ethan, she had believed their relationship was only an arrangement built from necessity. But somewhere along the way, something deeper had grown. Trust. Friendship. Love. Still, Clara carried one small fear. What if one day you realize I wasn't what you wanted? Ethan looked at her with surprise. Clara. She looked down. Richard thought I wasn't enough. The town thought I wasn't enough. Sometimes I still wonder if. Ethan gently interrupted. Those people never knew you. He reached for her hand. I watched you come here with nothing but courage. I watched you fail and try again. I watched you turn this house into a home. His voice softened. You were never someone who needed to prove you were enough. Clara looked at him. You believed in me before I believed in myself. Yes, Ethan said. And now you believe too. As the months passed, Clara began helping other women in town who struggled with the same doubts she once carried. A young bride who didn't know how to manage a household came to her for advice. Instead of judging her, Clara invited her into the kitchen. Everyone starts somewhere, Clara told her. She taught others what she had learned, not just recipes, but patience and confidence. The same community that once whispered about her now respected her. They admired her kindness more than her cooking. Because Clara had become proof that people could grow when given a chance. One evening, Ethan and Clara stood on the porch watching the sunset over the ranch. The field stretched endlessly before them. This place has changed, Ethan said. Clara smiled. Yes, it has. He looked at her. But I think the biggest change happened inside these walls. Clara knew exactly what he meant. The farmhouse was no longer just a building. It was where forgiveness lived. Where laughter returned. Where a broken bride found a family. Where a lonely rancher found a partner. And where two people who never expected love discovered that the strongest homes are not built from wood and stone. They are built from patience, trust, and the choice to stay. Years passed, and the Walker Ranch became one of the most respected homesteads in the entire valley. The fields that had once struggled under harsh weather now produced healthy crops every season. The barns were full, the fences were strong, and the farmhouse that had once felt empty was always filled with warmth and laughter. But whenever Clara Bennett looked back at those years, she never thought about the success first. She remembered a question. A simple question that had changed her entire life. Can you cook? At the time, those words had reminded her of every failure. They reminded her of Richard Hale standing in the church, telling her she wasn't enough. They reminded her of the whispers from neighbors who believed a woman without certain skills had little value. But Ethan Walker had asked the same question differently. He hadn't asked to judge her. He had asked because he wanted to know if she was willing to build something together. And her answer had changed everything. No, she had said. But I can learn. Those 5 words had opened the door to a life she never imagined. One spring morning, Clara stood in the kitchen preparing breakfast while the sounds of the ranch filled the air outside. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the house, and sunlight poured through the windows. A young girl sat at the table reading a book. It was Lily, now older, confident, and preparing to leave for school in town. Do you remember when I couldn't even make bread? Clara asked with a smile. Lily laughed. Of course I remember. Father said your first biscuits could have been used as building materials. Clara pretended to be offended. I thought we agreed never to mention those. From the doorway, Ethan laughed. I never agreed to that. The years had changed him too. His hair carried a little more silver, and his face showed the marks of a lifetime of hard work. But his eyes remained the same, the kind eyes of the man who had offered Clara respect when others offered judgment. He walked into the kitchen and kissed Clara's forehead. Still making the best bread in the county? She smiled. I learned from the best. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Who? Clara looked around the room. All of you. Because that was the truth. She had not built this life alone. Ethan had taught her patience. Lily had taught her unconditional love. The ranch had taught her strength. And every mistake had taught her that failure was not the end of a journey. It was part of becoming who she was meant to be. Later that afternoon, a young woman from town visited the ranch. She was recently married and struggling with the responsibilities of her new life. She admitted she felt embarrassed because she didn't know how to cook many meals or manage a household. Clara listened carefully. Years earlier, she would have understood that pain perfectly. I feel like everyone expects me to already know everything, the young woman confessed. Clara smiled gently. No one starts knowing everything. But what if I fail? Clara placed a comforting hand on hers. Then you learn. The young woman looked surprised. That's it? That's it. Clara told her the story of the day Ethan asked her if she could cook. She explained that the most important thing she learned was not how to prepare a perfect meal. It was how to believe in herself. You don't have to be perfect to be worthy of love, Clara said. You just have to be willing to grow. Those words became something Clara shared with many others over the years. She became known not only for her cooking, but for her wisdom. People came to her for advice because she never forgot what it felt like to be the person everyone had already judged. One evening, as the sun set behind the ranch, Ethan and Clara sat together on the porch where they had spent countless nights watching the seasons change. You know, Ethan said, I still remember your answer. Clara smiled. My answer? The day I asked if you could cook. She laughed softly. I was terrified. I know. I thought you would send me away. Ethan shook his head. I had no intention of sending you anywhere. Why? He looked at her. Because I wasn't searching for someone who already knew how to do everything. I was searching for someone who had the courage to learn. Clara rested her head against his shoulder. And did you find her? Ethan smiled. I found more than that. The field stretched out before them, golden beneath the evening sky. Clara thought about the girl she had once been, the humiliated bride standing alone in a church, believing her future had disappeared. She wished she could go back and tell that younger version of herself something important. That one person's rejection did not define her. That mistakes did not make her worthless. That sometimes the hardest moments were only the beginning of something beautiful. The world had once remembered Clara Bennett as the bride who wasn't enough. But Ethan remembered her as the woman who was brave enough to try. And in the end, that was what changed everything. Not a perfect recipe. Not a flawless beginning. Just a simple answer from a woman willing to grow. No, but I can learn.